In the shadowed corridors of governments and intelligence agencies, some secrets are meant to remain buried, yet occasionally they seep into the world in ways that are as unsettling as they are inexplicable. Across continents, men and women who dared to expose classified knowledge have vanished under circumstances that defy reason, leaving behind only fragments of documents, hushed rumours, and questions that refuse to fade. Their stories trace a chilling pattern: brilliant minds confronted by forces they could neither see nor control, disappearing into silence while the world around them remains oblivious to the truths they carried. Through overgrown woodland paths, dimly lit urban offices, and the stark, sterile corridors of classified research facilities, you will follow these cases firsthand. You will encounter the scientists, analysts, and operatives who unearthed dangerous truths, the hidden documents and encrypted communications that cast long shadows, and the baffling events surrounding their sudden disappearances. Every step reveals a world where knowledge carries peril, and every discovery deepens the sense of unresolved mystery. The suspicious death of Frank Olson. In the tense early years of the Cold War, a network of laboratories scattered across the United States quietly pursued research the public was never meant to see. Behind guarded gates and secured corridors, scientists studied biological agents, psychological manipulation, and experimental chemicals, while intelligence officials searched for new methods that might offer strategic advantages in a world shaped by espionage and ideological conflict. Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland, had become the heart of the nation's biological research program, equipped with specialized laboratories, containment facilities, and security protocols designed to prevent any unauthorized exposure. Within those walls, pathogens such as anthrax, tularemia, and other dangerous bacteria were not only catalogued, but tested under controlled conditions, often in conjunction with chemical agents meant to amplify their effects. The atmosphere surrounding these programs was defined by secrecy, and those who worked inside them rarely spoke about their responsibilities, even to their closest families. Within that hidden environment, discoveries were carefully documented, classified, and locked away from public knowledge, leaving only a few privileged individuals aware of the true scope of the work. Among the scientists working inside this hidden world was a bacteriologist named Frank Olson. Born in Wisconsin in 1910, Olson had spent years building a career as a respected microbiologist, eventually becoming involved in research connected to the United States biological warfare efforts during and after the Second World War. By the early 1950s, he had established himself as a skilled researcher whose work intersected with some of the most sensitive programs conducted by the American government. Those who knew him described a thoughtful and intelligent man who approached scientific problems with careful precision, rarely displaying the sort of ambition or bravado often associated with the secretive world of intelligence research. Olson's early contributions included work on bacterial pathogenesis and immune response, which not only informed potential defense strategies, but also caught the attention of military intelligence for their strategic significance. For much of his career, Olson's work intersected with projects tied to the US Army's biological research program at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland. The facility had become the center of American biological warfare research, housing laboratories where scientists examined dangerous pathogens and explored ways such agents might be deployed or defended against in future conflicts. During the early Cold War, the importance of such work grew as officials feared that rival nations might be developing similar weapons. Researchers at Fort Detrick often collaborated with intelligence agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency, which had begun exploring unconventional techniques for interrogation and psychological influence. Fort Detrick's strict safety protocols, including biohazard containment and controlled access to certain labs, reflected the magnitude of the potential dangers, yet the classified nature of the work meant that even minor mishaps could be concealed rather than reported. By the autumn of 1953, however, something about the work Olson had witnessed appeared to be weighing heavily on him. Colleagues later recalled subtle changes in his demeanor, describing moments when he seemed distracted or unusually quiet during conversations about ongoing projects. While the pressures of classified research were not uncommon among scientists in that environment, Olson's unease appeared deeper than ordinary professional stress. According to accounts that surfaced later, he'd recently been exposed to aspects of intelligence programs that involved experimental methods for influencing human behavior. including research into powerful psychoactive substances. Documents released decades later confirmed that these experiments were part of the CIA's secret MK-Ultra program, which sought to explore the effects of LSD and other mind-altering chemicals on unwitting subjects. The moment many investigators would later focus on occurred during a retreat organised for scientists and intelligence officials in rural Maryland. The gathering took place in November 1953 at a secluded cabin where members of the intelligence community and researchers associated with military programs had assembled to discuss ongoing work. Such meetings were not unusual during that era, as scientists and intelligence officers frequently met to exchange information about new techniques or experimental results. Yet, what occurred during one evening of that retreat would eventually become central to the mystery surrounding Olson's death. Historical records indicate that the cabin was chosen for its isolation, minimizing the risk of observation by outsiders and creating a controlled environment where officials could observe participants' responses to various stimuli. Unbeknownst to several participants that evening, the gathering had also become an experiment. Intelligence officials had begun studying the effects of lysergic acid diethylamide, more commonly known as LSD, as part of a covert research initiative connected to the CIA program later identified as Project MK-Ultra. The drug, which could produce intense hallucinations and profound psychological effects, had attracted interest from officials who wondered whether it might be used to influence perception, extract information during interrogations, or disrupt hostile agents. Internal CIA memos later described the initiative as part of a broader effort to develop behavioral modification techniques that could provide an edge in espionage or counterintelligence operations. During the retreat, several scientists were secretly given the substance without their knowledge. The methods of administration varied, with some subjects receiving it in beverages, while others may have had it applied in other ways according to the declassified files. The intent was to observe their reactions under controlled conditions and to document the psychological and physiological effects of the drug. Olson's ingestion of LSD was, according to later government testimony, entirely involuntary. Accounts of the evening suggest that the experiment began almost casually. Drinks were shared among the participants, conversations continued late into the night, and at some point the drug was introduced into the glasses of several individuals. As the effects began to emerge, confusion spread through the room. Some participants reportedly reacted with laughter or curiosity, while others struggled to understand the strange sensations overtaking them. Olson, by all accounts, displayed visible anxiety, his calm demeanour giving way to nervous agitation as the effects of the substance intensified. Frank Olson was among those who'd unknowingly consumed the drug. In the days that followed the retreat, colleagues began noticing troubling changes in Olson's behaviour. Friends later recalled that he seemed deeply disturbed by the experience, describing feelings of anxiety and uncertainty about the work he had been doing. According to several accounts, he began expressing doubts about the direction of the research programs in which he had participated, raising questions about their ethical boundaries and long-term consequences. Such concerns placed him in an ambiguous position, a man possessing knowledge considered vital to national security, yet expressing unease about the very experiments he had helped carry out. Within the closed world of Cold War intelligence research, such concerns carried serious implications. Scientists working on classified programs possessed information considered vital to national security, and officials were careful to monitor anyone who appeared unstable or uncertain about their role. As Olson's distress became more noticeable, those responsible for overseeing the programs began searching for a way to address the situation. The CIA's internal reports suggest that at least some officials feared he might speak openly or compromise sensitive information, although the exact degree of this concern remains unclear. Concerned about his condition, intelligence officials arranged for Olson to travel to New York City for evaluation. He was accompanied by a colleague who remained with him throughout the trip, and together they checked into a room at the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. The visit was described as an opportunity for Olson to consult with a physician who had experience working with individuals involved in sensitive government research. At the same time, the arrangement ensured that Olson would remain under close observation while his condition was assessed. Olson's travel and hotel arrangements were meticulously documented in internal CIA files, underscoring the agency's careful monitoring of his movements during this critical period. For 2 days, Olsen moved through the busy streets of the city while discussing his situation with those assigned to monitor him. Reports suggest that he continued expressing uncertainty about his future, at times speaking about the possibility of leaving his position altogether. The idea that a scientist involved in classified work might abandon his role raised concerns among the officials responsible for maintaining secrecy around the programs. Eyewitness accounts describe Olsen walking through Manhattan in the late November chill, visibly tense, with his thoughts reportedly occupied by the ethical and personal consequences of his recent experiences. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning on November the 28th, 1953, a sudden crash broke the quiet outside the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. Guests and night staff rushed toward the windows after hearing the sound of shattering glass, followed by a heavy impact on the pavement below. When authorities arrived at the scene, they discovered the body of Frank Olsen lying on the street outside the building. He had fallen from a 10th floor window, an image that would later be seared into public and historical memory. Police began investigating the incident immediately, speaking with Olsen's companion and examining the hotel room where the fall had occurred. According to the account provided by the man sharing the room, Olsen had risen suddenly during the night and run toward the closed window before crashing through the glass. The explanation suggested that Olsen, already struggling with emotional distress, had taken his own life during a moment of instability. Officials reportedly found no signs of forced entry or foul play within the room itself, though later forensic inquiries would question whether the initial assessment had captured all relevant details. Authorities quickly ruled Olsen's death a suicide. At the time, the conclusion attracted little public attention. Details about Olsen's work remained classified, and his family was told that he had suffered a psychological breakdown linked to professional stress. The official explanation remained largely unchallenged for many years, and the case gradually faded from public view. Government correspondence from the period emphasizes discretion, noting that public disclosure of Olsen's work or the circumstances of his death could compromise national security. For more than 2 decades, the incident remained largely unknown outside government circles. Olsen's role within biological warfare research and intelligence projects was rarely discussed, and the circumstances surrounding his final days remained buried within classified reports. To those outside the intelligence community, the story of the scientist who had fallen from a New York hotel window seemed like a private tragedy rather than a historical mystery. It was only in the 1970s, during investigations into CIA experimentation programs, that the full picture began to emerge. That silence began to unravel in the 1970s when investigations exposed the existence of the covert CIA program known as Project MKUltra. Congressional inquiries revealed that intelligence agencies had conducted secret experiments involving drugs, hypnosis, and other psychological techniques in an attempt to understand how human behavior might be influenced or controlled. Among the many details uncovered during those investigations was the revelation that Frank Olsen had been given LSD without his knowledge during the Maryland retreat shortly before his death. The disclosure transformed the way the case was viewed, casting a shadow of doubt over the original investigation and the initial suicide ruling. For Olsen's family, the revelation came as a profound shock. They had never been told that he had been subjected to an unconsented experiment involving a powerful hallucinogen. Learning that the event had taken place only days before his fatal fall raised unsettling questions about what he might have experienced during that period and how it could have affected his state of mind. Family members would later participate in legal actions and public advocacy, seeking acknowledgement and accountability from the government for its role in Olsen's death. The revelation that Olsen had unknowingly been given LSD raised unsettling new questions. If the experiment had contributed to his distress, why had officials chosen to conceal that fact for more than 20 years? And if his mental state had been altered by a powerful drug administered without his consent, could the official explanation of suicide truly be considered complete? Journalists investigating the case highlighted inconsistencies in witness testimony, timelines, and subsequent medical examinations, further fueling speculation about the circumstances surrounding Olsen's death. Over time, journalists, historians, and Olsen's own family began revisiting the events of that night. Investigators examined witness accounts, reviewed medical reports, and explored the broader context of Cold War intelligence experiments that had surrounded Olsen's work. Some researchers pointed to inconsistencies in the descriptions of the fall, while others questioned whether Olsen had been under greater pressure than authorities had originally acknowledged. Declassified documents and investigative reporting helped reconstruct a timeline that shed light on the complex interplay of secrecy, experimentation, and oversight. In later years, even forensic examinations of Olsen's remains would introduce additional questions about whether injuries might have occurred before the fall itself. Although these findings did not produce definitive answers, they fueled renewed debate about whether the original investigation had fully explored every possibility. The case remains a cautionary tale of the ethical and human consequences of clandestine experimentation, illustrating the thin line between national security and personal tragedy. Decades after the fall from the hotel window, the case still resists a clear explanation. The story of Frank Olsen now occupies a strange place within the history of Cold War intelligence, standing at the intersection of scientific research, covert experimentation, and the powerful forces of secrecy that defined that era. Somewhere between the hidden experiments of that retreat and the shattered window above the streets of Manhattan, the final truth about what happened to Frank Olsen remains buried in a silence that history has never fully broken. The tragic end of Karen Silkwood. The late 1970s saw the rise of whistleblowers at nuclear facilities, but few cases drew as much attention as Karen Silkwood's. Born in Longview, Texas in 1946, Silkwood moved to Oklahoma as a young adult to work at the Kerr-McGee plutonium plant in Crescent. From the outset, she displayed a sharp intellect and meticulous approach to her work, quickly gaining a reputation among her colleagues for diligence and precision. In an era when nuclear safety protocols were still evolving, her awareness of potential hazards placed her in a position of both responsibility and risk. Those around her recognized that she would not overlook the small details that often carried profound consequences for worker safety and public health, particularly in a plant where exposure to radioactive plutonium was a daily reality, and even brief contact could result in long-term health effects, including lung, liver, and bone tissue damage. At the Kerr-McGee plutonium plant, Silkwood worked as a chemical technician responsible for monitoring contamination levels and handling plutonium with extreme care. The plant itself was a complex labyrinth of laboratories, storage areas, and processing units, designed to minimize radiation exposure yet inherently fraught with risk. Inside, workers were expected to follow strict procedures, but Silkwood observed that lapses were not uncommon. Protective equipment was often reused or inadequately maintained, and decontamination protocols were inconsistently enforced. She began keeping detailed notes and photographing areas of concern, knowing that formal complaints had often been ignored by management. Each entry reflected not only scientific precision, but a growing unease with the culture of secrecy surrounding nuclear operations, which often prioritized production quotas over worker safety. Colleagues remembered her meticulous nature, often arriving early to inspect equipment, double-check readings, and record anomalies that could have gone unnoticed. One co-worker later recounted observing Silkwood taking repeated measurements in areas where contamination had previously been reported, sometimes returning hours later to verify results. She was methodical, thorough, and unwavering in her insistence that the plant adhere to safety standards. In an environment where errors could have life-altering consequences, her attention to detail was not merely professional diligence, it was a quiet act of courage that marked her as someone unwilling to accept negligence as normal. Internal memos later confirmed that Silkwood had documented repeated breaches in safety procedures, including improperly sealed containers, inadequate ventilation systems, and inconsistent logging of contamination levels, all of which heightened the risk of internal radiation exposure. By 1974, Silkwood had begun documenting serious safety violations, including lapses in protective gear, exceeding exposure limits, and improper handling of plutonium samples. Her records included dates, times, and the names of individuals involved in unsafe practices. Some of these incidents involved contaminated gloves, improperly labeled containers, and alarm systems that failed to signal dangerous radiation levels. These documented violations were significant because plutonium is a highly toxic alpha emitter. Even minimal exposure can lead to severe, long-term health consequences. Silkwood's careful tracking of contamination incidents later became critical evidence in assessing the plant's adherence to safety regulations and played a key role in subsequent legal proceedings against Kerr-McGee. Her growing awareness of dangerous conditions prompted her to take notes and photographs, some intended for union officials and journalists investigating the plant. Silkwood's intent was not to undermine her employer arbitrarily, but to protect her co-workers and the public from unseen hazards. She became particularly concerned after learning that incidents of contamination were being minimized in official reports, leaving employees unaware of actual exposure risks. In a time when the nuclear industry operated largely in secrecy, the act of compiling evidence was inherently risky, placing her in a vulnerable position both professionally and personally. Documents she prepared included detailed photos of glove box contamination, measurements of radioactive dust, and notations about procedural violations that could directly threaten workers' health, all of which she intended to deliver to investigative journalists and union officials. Supervisors reportedly questioned her diligence, but her persistence continued despite increasing tension with management. Some accounts suggest that she faced subtle intimidation, shifts changed without notice, documents went missing, and co-workers were warned to avoid discussing her activities. Yet Silkwood pressed on, confident that her findings were accurate and morally necessary. Internal memos later revealed that management considered her a potential liability, though the full extent of their concern remains unclear. By raising questions that implicated plant procedures and potentially Kerr-McGee's liability, she had attracted attention that extended beyond her immediate supervisors. Government safety audits from the period corroborated many of the violations Silkwood reported, showing systemic lapses that endangered all plant employees. Union members later recalled her expressing frustration that her complaints were ignored, yet she remained determined to ensure the safety of her co-workers. She attended union meetings regularly, sharing insights and raising questions about procedural lapses. Her colleagues noted that she spoke passionately about contamination concerns and the need for transparency, despite warnings to exercise caution. These discussions, often recorded in union notes, illustrate a woman aware of the stakes involved, balancing her scientific responsibility with the personal risk of challenging powerful industrial interests. The union itself had filed multiple complaints with the Department of Labour, citing Silkwood's observations, though the responses were often delayed or inconclusive, leaving the plant largely free from immediate accountability. Medical records revealed unusual levels of plutonium in her body during routine tests, prompting further concern about exposure and potential retaliation. Some tests showed contamination higher than would be expected even for someone working directly with plutonium, raising questions about handling procedures and protective measures. These findings were documented in reports later submitted to government oversight agencies, yet the investigation was limited, and the significance of her elevated levels was largely underplayed at the time. By the time Silkwood sought medical attention, she'd already become a visible figure in union complaints, making her both a key witness and a potential target within the plant's culture of secrecy. Medical experts later testified in court that her contamination levels were sufficient to cause serious long-term health risks, adding weight to concerns about negligence. As she prepared documents to hand to investigative journalist Drew Pearson, Silkwood's movements became closely monitored, though by whom remained unclear. Friends reported that she seemed increasingly aware of being watched, noting unfamiliar vehicles outside her apartment and strangers appearing near her workplace. While some of these observations could have been coincidental, the pattern suggests that her activities were attracting attention from parties invested in limiting the dissemination of sensitive information. Her files included photographs of contaminated surfaces, internal memos, and safety violation records, making them highly significant should they reach public scrutiny. Some contemporaneous reports hint that security personnel at the plant were instructed to track her movements, though official records remain sparse. Witnesses noted that she'd scheduled meetings outside the plant to share her findings, insisting on confidentiality and discretion. She had planned a rendezvous with a journalist and union representatives to deliver the most sensitive documents, understanding that any mishandling could jeopardize her mission or her safety. This deliberate care reflects her awareness of the risks she faced, as well as her commitment to ensuring that the truth of working conditions at Kerr-McGee would be documented and potentially acted upon. Silkwood's insistence on discretion underscores how seriously she regarded both the integrity of her evidence and the potential threats posed by powerful corporate interests. The night before her fatal trip, Silkwood reportedly stayed late at the plant, meticulously reviewing her files and taking photographs of records that detailed safety violations. Her colleagues recalled her expressing concern about missing or altered records, fearing that management might attempt to suppress evidence. She checked each photograph, verified contamination logs, and organized documents in preparation for their transfer to trusted hands. This final act of preparation underscores the seriousness with which she approached her role as a whistleblower, aware that the consequences could be severe. Some documents included lab sheets indicating unusually high alpha radiation readings and internal notes that contradicted official plant statements, which later became central in court proceedings. Early on November 13, 1974, she set out in her car toward the home of a contact, carrying the materials that would later become central to the mystery surrounding her death. Witnesses later recounted seeing her drive along US Highway 66 in Oklahoma, a route she had traveled many times before. Her vehicle, a Mercury, was later found in a crash several miles outside of Tulsa, with damage that would fuel suspicion and speculation for decades. The timing, location, and nature of the crash raised questions that persisted long after official reports were issued. Some investigative journalists noted the presence of unusual tire tracks and minor skid marks inconsistent with standard accident patterns, suggesting the possibility of interference or mechanical tampering. Evidence from the crash site suggested unusual circumstances. Skid marks inconsistent with a standard accident, missing debris, and signs that the vehicle may have been struck or interfered with before leaving the road. Investigators at the scene noted that the guardrail and surrounding terrain did not fully explain the severity of the crash. Additional forensic details, including blood spatter patterns and vehicle positioning, hinted at the possibility of outside interference. While some elements could be attributed to road conditions or human error, the combination of anomalies has made the case a subject of ongoing debate. Photographs taken by police revealed sections of the vehicle body missing from the scene, further complicating the narrative of an accidental crash. The official investigation ruled the crash accidental, but subsequent inquiries highlighted discrepancies in the timeline, vehicle condition, and witness statements. Autopsy reports confirmed contamination in her body, and toxicology tests indicated exposure levels unusual, even for a plant worker. Journalists and whistleblower advocates noted gaps in documentation, such as missing witness testimonies and unrecorded phone calls. These inconsistencies have fueled theories that her death may not have been accidental, raising questions about the extent to which her activism threatened powerful interests. Government reports released years later, including documents from the Atomic Energy Commission, showed that safety practices at Kerr-McGee were repeatedly cited as deficient during routine inspections, establishing a pattern of negligence. Journalists and union representatives who received fragments of Silkwood's documentation described gaps and anomalies, fueling suspicions that her death was more than a simple accident. Drew Pearson published some of her findings posthumously, revealing lapses in safety and management practices. Yet key evidence was never recovered, and portions of her notes remained missing, leaving an incomplete picture of her discoveries. Analysts studying the case point to these gaps as indicative of potential suppression, emphasizing that Silkwood's careful preparation made it unlikely she would have lost critical documents herself. Some portions of her reports were later used as evidence in the landmark Silkwood v. Kerr-McGee lawsuit, which exposed systemic negligence at the facility and resulted in a landmark $10 million settlement for her estate. In the decades since, debates over her death have persisted, with historians, investigative reporters, and whistleblower advocates weighing the balance of accident, negligence, and possible foul play. Books, documentaries, and congressional hearings have revisited the circumstances surrounding her final days, yet no definitive conclusion has been universally accepted. The combination of documented safety violations, missing records, and unusual crash details continues to captivate researchers, highlighting the precarious position of those who challenge industrial secrecy in high-risk environments. Her case has since become a benchmark for discussions of whistleblower protection, corporate accountability, and the dangers faced by employees who confront unsafe practices, ultimately influencing labour law reforms and nuclear safety regulations. And yet, the documents she carried vanished with her, leaving questions that no investigation has ever fully answered. The enigmatic death of Mark Lombardi. In a quiet Brooklyn studio, walls lined with intricate diagrams and threads connecting hundreds of names, Mark Lombardi laboured over his maps of hidden networks. Each chart unfolded into a complex web of financial institutions, political figures, and covert operations, meticulously cross-referenced and layered with dates, contracts, and public records. Pencil lines traced relationships that few could understand fully, transforming dense information into a visual language that revealed connections invisible to conventional reporting. Shadows fell across tables crowded with paper, binders, and notes, creating a sanctuary of secrecy in which every detail demanded attention. The studio, cluttered yet purposeful, became the stage for investigations that exposed the quiet intersections of power and influence, as Lombardi sought to make the invisible visible. From a young age, he possessed a natural ability to spot patterns where others saw disorder. Born in 1951 in the Bronx, he developed a meticulous eye for detail and a fascination with networks of cause and effect that would later shape his work. Early experiences with organised structures in school and an enduring curiosity about political scandals gave him a sense of how complex systems could mask underlying truths. Friends described him as quiet but intensely focused, someone who absorbed information with a precision that would define his investigative diagrams. Lombardi's professional foundation as an accountant honed the skills he would later use in his diagrams. Following college, he worked with financial records, audits and ledgers, learning to follow money, identify discrepancies, and understand the subtle ways corporate and political interests intersected. While these tasks might have seemed routine to colleagues, Lombardi began to see stories hidden in the numbers, patterns that suggested influence, concealment, and manipulation. His analytical precision would eventually allow him to transform raw financial data into visual narratives that illuminated global networks. By the mid-1980s, Lombardi had transitioned from accounting into art, combining his analytical skills with visual creativity. He began producing diagrams that mapped relationships across international banking, corporate holdings, and political actors, turning complex, often opaque information into legible patterns. Each node represented an entity or individual. Each line represented a documented connection. Over time, his charts became increasingly intricate, layering decades of transactions, corporate structures, and political events into single, coherent visual statements. Among his earliest prominent works were diagrams tracing the Bank of Credit and Commerce International (BCCI) scandal. Lombardi meticulously charted the flow of money through multiple banks, shell companies, and international actors, illustrating a sprawling network of financial misconduct. His work offered clarity to journalists and researchers, providing a visual roadmap that captured connections invisible to conventional investigation. Later projects expanded into other controversial areas, including corporate influence over political campaigns, offshore accounts, and ties between private contractors and intelligence operations. As Lombardi's work drew recognition in the art world, it also drew scrutiny. Solo exhibitions displayed his meticulous diagrams, praised for both their complexity and their analytical rigour. Yet the subjects he explored were not merely abstract concepts. They touched on individuals and institutions whose actions were often shielded from public view. Friends observed his growing intensity, noting that he spent long hours in the studio, often sleeping little and speaking frequently of patterns and connections he alone seemed to fully comprehend. In the final months of his life, Lombardi focused on a particularly ambitious project, seeking to consolidate years of research into an overarching map of influence and transactions. He reviewed countless public records, contracts, and media reports, cross-referencing details to ensure accuracy and uncover hidden links. Colleagues noted that his attention to verification was extreme. He would check a single connection multiple times, determined to prevent error in a body of work that might expose corruption or wrongdoing at the highest levels. This period was marked by both professional recognition and personal intensity. While galleries and museums began to take an interest in his work, Lombardi remained absorbed in his research, rarely leaving the studio for more than brief errands. Friends recalled his constant focus, his tendency to speak in terms of networks, nodes, and transactions, as if tracing patterns was both a vocation and a necessity. The weight of the information he was cataloguing, combined with the potential consequences of exposing sensitive relationships, added an almost tangible pressure to his daily life. On March 22, 2000, Lombardi was found dead in his Williamsburg studio, hanging from a sprinkler pipe. Authorities ruled it a suicide, a conclusion that was accepted officially but quietly questioned by colleagues and friends. Observers noted that while Lombardi had been under stress, his final weeks had been filled with intense but controlled work, and he showed no overt signs of despondency. The scene contained his sketches, binders, and partially completed diagrams, a visual testament to the projects that had dominated his attention until his final hours. The circumstances surrounding his death, combined with the sensitive nature of his projects, fueled speculation in both art and investigative communities. Some questioned whether all factors had been considered in the official investigation. Others pointed to missing pieces of his research, including diagrams and notes that could have provided further insight into financial and political networks. Though no definitive evidence of foul play emerged, the timing of his death and the focus of his work left lingering uncertainty. In the years since, Lombardi's diagrams have taken on renewed significance. Researchers, journalists, and scholars continue to study his work to understand networks of finance, political influence, and corporate power. Institutions housing his diagrams have noted increased interest, particularly when examining systemic corruption and patterns of behavior that intersect with law, finance, and government. His work has influenced both investigative methodology and visual analysis, showing how careful documentation and pattern recognition can illuminate complex systems in ways that narrative reporting alone cannot. Even as exhibitions of his work travel internationally, his death remains a haunting mystery. Lombardi's diagrams, precise and compelling, continue to reveal relationships that were once hidden, yet the full story of the forces he traced and the consequences he may have faced for uncovering them remains unresolved. His legacy persists in the interlocking lines of his work, a record of a mind committed to uncovering patterns that most would prefer remained unseen. Within the intricate lines of his work, a truth lingers that may never reveal itself. The strange case of David Kelly. The British countryside around Oxfordshire held a quiet, almost ordinary appearance. Yet, within it, David Kelly lived a life defined by secrecy and technical expertise, navigating the fine line between science and national security. His modest home offered few clues about the depth of his work, where expertise in biological and chemical weapons intersected with intelligence assessments and government directives. Kelly had built a career that demanded precision, discretion, and the ability to interpret complex data that could have far-reaching consequences. Even casual visitors sensed the meticulous order he maintained, a reflection of the analytical mind that allowed him to operate at the intersection of science and state. The calm of the surrounding fields belied the pressures that accompanied his professional life, a tension few could understand from the outside. From his early years, Kelly had displayed a meticulous intellect and a determination to understand complex biological systems, which led him into a career in microbiology and defense research. Born in 1944, he demonstrated a fascination with the natural sciences from a young age, excelling in school and earning scholarships that eventually propelled him into advanced scientific studies. His early academic achievements laid the groundwork for a career in areas few pursued, including the sensitive field of chemical and biological weapons research. Teachers and mentors later recalled a student who approached each problem with patience and rigor, qualities that would define his later professional life. This combination of intellectual curiosity and methodical discipline prepared him for the extraordinary demands of working with classified information. By the 1990s, he had become a respected authority on biological and chemical weapons, consulting for the Ministry of Defense and international organizations tasked with monitoring compliance with arms treaties. His expertise extended to identifying potential violations of the Chemical Weapons Convention, assessing stockpiles, and providing guidance on safe handling and disposal of hazardous agents. Through international postings and collaborative investigations, Kelly developed a reputation for technical accuracy and professional integrity, often navigating bureaucratic hurdles while remaining focused on scientific fact. His reports were considered reliable and objective, yet their content sometimes unsettled political or military authorities who preferred ambiguity over exposure. He became a figure both valued and quietly scrutinized, operating in a world where knowledge itself could be dangerous. His work occasionally brought him into contact with sensitive intelligence reports, some of which challenged public narratives about the existence or scope of weapons of mass destruction. Kelly analysed intercepted communications, field reports, and treaty documentation, looking for inconsistencies or evidence of concealed stockpiles. The information he handled often contradicted statements made by political leaders, leaving him in the uncomfortable position of holding knowledge that could provoke international controversy. While he maintained professional detachment, the tension between empirical findings and public claims grew increasingly evident as global attention focused on Iraq in the early 2000s. The meticulous assessments that had guided his career suddenly became points of political sensitivity. In mid-2003, amidst escalating tensions in the Middle East, Kelly's role shifted from behind-the-scenes research to public exposure when he became linked to media reports questioning government claims about Iraq's weapons programs. Journalists investigating intelligence dossiers identified him as a key source, placing his name alongside statements that challenged official narratives presented to Parliament and the public. The shift from confidential consultant to publicly named figure transformed his professional life overnight, introducing scrutiny and speculation at a level he had not experienced before. Interviews, briefings, and off-the-record conversations now carried the weight of potential political fallout. Kelly's expertise had always been valuable, but suddenly it had become a liability in the court of public opinion. Colleagues noticed subtle changes in his demeanour during this period, a quiet tension that suggested the increasing pressure of balancing professional ethics with political scrutiny. He became more withdrawn, taking long walks in the surrounding countryside while reviewing documents in his mind. Friends observed that he avoided casual conversation about work, yet he often expressed concern about the consequences of misinterpretation or misrepresentation of the evidence he had collected. Even those closest to him noted a seriousness in his tone that hinted at the burden of responsibility he now carried. The professional pride that had always defined him coexisted uneasily with the growing awareness of personal risk. When journalists identified him as a key source, Kelly faced intense public and governmental attention, a spotlight that few scientists of his background were ever trained to handle. Government officials pressured him for clarification, media inquiries demanded statements, and colleagues quietly debated how much information he could safely disclose. Each public acknowledgement carried ramifications for national security and his personal reputation, creating a constant tension that compounded the stresses of his already demanding work. Though he continued to provide accurate assessments, the exposure transformed routine duties into a high-stakes balancing act. The relentless scrutiny tested both his expertise and his endurance. In the days that followed, Kelly attended official inquiries and consultations, providing testimony while navigating an environment of intense media speculation and internal government investigations. He answered questions from parliamentary committees, clarified technical assessments, and attempted to remain factual and impartial despite the growing intensity surrounding him. Observers noted that he spoke deliberately, carefully, aware that every word could be dissected by officials, journalists, or political commentators. The atmosphere of observation extended beyond formal inquiries, creating a sense that he was constantly being watched and evaluated. Even small interactions could carry implications far beyond their immediate context. Despite his careful preparation, the strain of conflicting obligations and the public exposure of sensitive knowledge seemed to weigh heavily, manifesting in fatigue and moments of visible stress observed by those around him. Kelly's walks became longer, and he spent evenings reviewing notes alone in his home, reflecting on the broader consequences of his disclosures. Friends noticed sleepless nights and moments of distraction that contrasted with his normally meticulous routine. While he never spoke of despair, the tension and ethical weight of his position were evident in quiet behaviours that indicated profound concern. It was a burden few outside his profession could understand. His disappearance on July 17, 2003, set off an immediate search, and within hours his body was found in nearby woodland, triggering widespread questions about the circumstances surrounding his death. Emergency responders documented the scene carefully, and authorities immediately began an investigation to determine the cause and context. The news quickly reached national media, sparking debate and speculation about the pressures he had faced and the nature of his exposure as a government source. Public attention magnified every detail, from the location of his body to the timeline of his movements in the final hours. The intersection of personal tragedy and political controversy created a narrative that seemed larger than life. Official reports ultimately concluded that Kelly had taken his own life. Yet, inconsistencies in the investigation, the timing of his exposure, and his prior communications with colleagues created a cloud of unresolved speculation. Analysts and journalists alike noted unanswered questions about his final meetings, the documents he carried, and the exact pressures he faced from both media and government channels. The official explanation satisfied procedural requirements, but for those who understood the sensitivity of his work, doubt persisted. The circumstances surrounding his death remained a subject of inquiry and debate, and the full picture of events was never fully accessible to the public. The combination of public scrutiny, classified obligations, and personal ethics left an enduring puzzle as colleagues and observers debated what pressures might have contributed to the tragedy. His career, once defined by technical accuracy and objectivity, had collided with the political and media spotlight in ways that transformed routine scientific assessment into high-risk exposure. The questions his death raised about the treatment of experts, the boundaries of governmental secrecy, and the consequences of disclosure lingered quietly among those who knew him. Kelly's life and death highlighted the delicate balance between knowledge, responsibility, and the unforeseen consequences of revealing uncomfortable truths. Kelly's scientific work and the choices he made in exposing controversial information remain a testament to the dangers faced by those who navigate worlds of secrecy and power, a legacy intertwined with questions that resist definitive answers. Each investigation he contributed to, every report he reviewed, and every statement he made in Parliament had the potential to ripple far beyond the laboratory or office, reminding observers that expertise can carry both influence and peril. The weight of information, combined with the intense spotlight of politics and media, shaped a final chapter that continues to provoke discussion, reflection, and unresolved curiosity. Even amid official conclusions, the final truth of David Kelly's last days may never be uncovered. The locked bag mystery of Gareth Williams. The silence inside a central London flat can often be unremarkable, but the absence of any sign of life that morning hinted at something deeply wrong, a tension that only grew as authorities approached. No sounds of movement, no lights on, no ordinary morning routines unfolding. The emptiness itself seemed to demand attention. For those familiar with the routines of intelligence operatives, a sudden and unexplained absence could carry consequences far beyond simple concern. It was this uneasy anticipation that first drew investigators toward the flat in Pimlico, unaware that the enigma awaiting them would challenge every expectation of logic and reason. The apartment itself was small, with narrow hallways and a compact layout that seemed incompatible with the circumstances discovered within. Within the intelligence community, only a handful of individuals worked on cyber operations of such sensitivity that mistakes could ripple across national security, and Williams was among them. His assignments often involved encrypted communications, covert monitoring, and the assessment of digital threats that few outside his immediate team could comprehend. Colleagues regarded him as both invaluable and elusive, a man whose understanding of the systems he managed made him indispensable, yet whose private life remained tightly contained within the walls of his flat. The stakes of his work created a constant tension that few outside the shadowed corridors of British intelligence could imagine, and any misstep could have exposed entire operations to compromise. Tasked with safeguarding encrypted communications and monitoring networks for potential breaches, he operated in a world where every detail mattered, and every anomaly was cause for concern. The technologies he managed were not simply tools, they were gatekeepers of information that could determine the success or failure of operations on a global scale. Each day demanded meticulous attention to seemingly invisible threads connecting classified intelligence to actionable insights, and every oversight risked exposure that could reverberate across international channels. Williams's expertise required a precision that left no room for distraction or error, a level of focus that few could maintain under ordinary circumstances, let alone under the unique pressures of his environment. His work included monitoring threats that spanned multiple countries, with sensitive communications often routed through encrypted channels that only he could reliably manage. Those who collaborated with him described a meticulous, intensely focused professional whose quiet presence concealed a mind always several steps ahead of any problem or threat. His attention to detail extended to every facet of his life, from lab notes to personal routines, and his colleagues often remarked that his careful habits reflected the exacting standards demanded by the work he carried out. Williams rarely revealed vulnerabilities, yet those who observed him closely noted subtle signs of tension, a constant awareness of unseen consequences, and a caution that suggested he carried the weight of responsibilities few could fully appreciate. Some colleagues would later comment on the meticulous way he organized his equipment and documents, which made the later discovery of the bag even more perplexing. Days without communication were unusual, but as hours turned into an entire morning without word, suspicion escalated, drawing both colleagues and authorities into the growing enigma. It began with unanswered calls, then unreturned emails, then the creeping awareness that a man whose life was so structured and predictable had seemingly vanished. The initial concern among peers quickly evolved into an urgent investigation, as the implications of an unexplained absence extended beyond personal worry into professional alarm. For someone in his position, disappearing could leave critical systems unmonitored and sensitive information potentially vulnerable, a scenario that amplified the stakes for every subsequent step taken by investigators. Security logs and access records revealed no unusual entries, adding another layer of impossibility to the situation. The scene that greeted investigators defied explanation. A small sports bag padlocked from the outside, containing the body of the analyst, with no indication of how he could have ended up inside it. The physical impossibility of the situation immediately drew intense scrutiny as forensic specialists examined the bag, the apartment, and every surrounding clue. Questions multiplied with each passing hour. How could a grown man be confined within such a small space? Could the act have been voluntary, or did it require outside intervention? Every element of the scene seemed deliberately contradictory, challenging assumptions and compelling authorities to reconsider what was physically plausible. Investigators examined the bag's construction and padlock mechanism, finding no evidence of tampering that could explain how it had been sealed from the outside. Forensic teams combed the apartment, examining every trace of evidence, while intelligence agencies quietly sifted through records and communications, yet the case only deepened in complexity. Analysts tracked digital footprints, emails, and system access logs, attempting to reconstruct Williams's final movements. Surveillance cameras revealed nothing unusual, and no forced entry suggested an outside intruder. Investigators pored over every available piece of data, yet the more they analysed, the less clear the sequence of events became. The evidence pointed simultaneously in multiple directions, offering theories but no definitive answers, each new fact adding weight to the sense of incomprehensibility surrounding the death. News of the inexplicable circumstances spread rapidly, with media speculating on every possibility, from a tragic accident to deliberate foul play, while official statements offered few answers. Headlines emphasized the strangeness of the discovery, fueling public fascination and international attention. Pundits debated whether a death so puzzling could have been self-inflicted, a misadventure, or connected to Williams's work in cyber intelligence. Meanwhile, official agencies maintained tight-lipped responses, revealing only that the death occurred under investigation and that details could not be disclosed. The tension between public curiosity and classified knowledge intensified the air of mystery surrounding the case. Experts pointed out the rarity of deaths occurring under such physically improbable conditions, highlighting the enduring questions about methodology and motive. Even after exhaustive investigation, the circumstances of his death remained puzzling, with every lead seeming to raise further questions about how a highly trained analyst could have ended up in such an impossible situation. Coroners and forensic specialists carefully reviewed autopsy findings, toxicology reports, and physical evidence, yet no conclusive scenario could fully account for the death. Investigators grappled with inconsistencies in timelines, anomalies in the scene, and the absence of any clear motive or method. Every answer uncovered seemed to spawn additional questions, reinforcing the sense that Williams's fate lay beyond conventional explanation. Analysts noted that even the most minor detail, the orientation of the bag, its placement in the apartment, and the absence of fingerprints, added to the sense of incomprehensibility. The events surrounding the analyst's death continue to echo through intelligence circles, a reminder of the vulnerability that shadows even the most controlled and secretive worlds. Colleagues remember him as a consummate professional whose skills were unparalleled, yet whose life ended in a manner that underscored the limits of human understanding when intersecting with secrecy and risk. The case has since been discussed in academic, media, and intelligence forums, inspiring both technical analysis and speculative debate. Though the public record offers fragments of information, the full narrative remains obscured by a combination of classified operations and the sheer impossibility of the scene itself. Inside the padlocked bag, the full truth of what happened may remain locked away forever. The poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko. The streets of London in late 2006 were bustling as usual, yet for one man the city seemed to close in with quiet menace. What began as a minor fatigue soon grew into alarming weakness, an illness that puzzled even experienced physicians. Familiar streets, the hum of buses, and the chatter of pedestrians suddenly carried a sense of tension, as if unseen eyes were observing each movement. Each encounter, each passing moment, became a reminder that defiance in the shadows could carry deadly consequences. Ordinary city life had transformed into a stage for a threat, both hidden and lethal. Even routine activities, walking to the local shops, attending meetings, taking a cab to interviews, felt fraught with risk. Every handshake, every shared cup of tea, could have been the vector of something extraordinary and invisible. He was aware of the dangers but pressed forward, driven by the need to reveal truths that few outside the intelligence world would ever see. London itself, familiar and ordinary to most, had become a labyrinth where ordinary rules of safety no longer applied. Within the shadowed halls of Russian intelligence, he had moved with precision, gaining access to secrets few could comprehend. As a lieutenant colonel in the FSB, he had overseen counterintelligence operations and covert surveillance missions where a single misstep could mean death. His responsibilities exposed him to actions morally ambiguous and legally dubious, yet he refused to remain silent when he witnessed abuses of power. Those years had honed a cautious intelligence, a combination of skill and principle that would later place him directly in the path of enemies who operated without visible constraints. Some of his missions involved tracking high-level targets, gathering evidence, and observing illicit operations that could implicate powerful figures. He'd seen how the agency punished dissent quietly, often with methods designed to disappear people without leaving traces. That experience gave him an understanding of how lethal secrets could be when exposed. Even as he later spoke publicly, a lingering knowledge of those methods informed every step, every interaction, and every precaution he took in exile. Defection brought both freedom and vulnerability, a new life in a foreign city still permeated with invisible threats. Settling in London offered a measure of safety, but each public statement, meeting, or interview now carried inherent risk. He maintained careful routines, scrutinized visitors, and limited exposure to potential hazards, yet the reach of those he had opposed extended far beyond national borders. Ordinary life became a careful negotiation with danger, each decision weighted with the knowledge that exposure could invite retaliation in ways both direct and insidious. Beyond mere physical survival, the psychological burden of defection added to the tension. Daily life in London was now interlaced with awareness that someone could be watching, following, or manipulating events from afar. Even brief lapses in attention could have consequences. Every email, every phone call, every minor interaction held the potential to carry subtle danger. The ordinary trappings of city life were transformed into a series of calculated risks, each demanding vigilance. Public accusations sent ripples through corridors of power, naming names and exposing covert operations that few dared to discuss. He detailed allegations of kidnappings, assassinations, and corruption orchestrated by state security services, drawing global attention and powerful enemies. Each interview and press release heightened the scrutiny, increasing the stakes of speaking the truth. Observers who had previously dismissed whispers now paid close attention, aware that someone in the shadows possessed both motive and capability to act decisively. Even minor revelations could trigger severe consequences. Documents he shared contained traces of operations that had never been public, and his commentary made the actions of state actors visible on a global stage. By illuminating these hidden activities, he became a target, a living symbol of the cost of exposing the unseen mechanisms of power. His words were factual, precise, and undeniable, yet they were also dangerous in a world where secrecy was enforced without mercy. Initial complaints of fatigue and nausea appeared ordinary, yet subtle signs hinted at something far more sinister. Small bruises began to appear on his skin, hair fell in tufts, and gastrointestinal distress intensified without explanation. Doctors were puzzled as no known illness matched the combination or speed of symptoms, and each new test deepened the mystery. Every hour brought anomalies that suggested the threat was neither conventional nor easily diagnosed, hinting at a terrifyingly deliberate precision. Within days, the illness escalated further, leaving organs to fail in patterns that baffled even the most experienced clinicians. Blood tests revealed abnormalities, yet the source of the problem remained elusive. Standard toxicology screens showed no trace of ordinary poisons, forcing medical staff to confront the possibility that something highly unusual was at work. Each deterioration in his condition emphasized the meticulous nature of the attack and the hidden hand behind it, one that seemed to operate with complete invisibility. Doctors attempted a range of interventions, but treatments failed to halt the rapid decline. Specialists in infectious diseases, toxicology, and internal medicine were brought in, but none could find a conventional explanation. Every investigative path initially appeared to lead nowhere, highlighting the complexity and calculated nature of the attack. The hospital, ordinarily a place of safety, became a site of suspense as the unseen agent continued its work, leaving experts struggling against the impossible. Investigators retraced every step, every meeting, and every meal, searching for a hidden culprit whose methods defied known science. Surveillance footage, travel records, and witness statements were meticulously examined, revealing a narrow window of exposure that offered few clues. Each lead brought both clarity and further complexity, as the method suggested access to materials and knowledge far beyond ordinary reach. The investigation became a tense search into a world where ordinary rules no longer applied, and even small details could be critical. Tests eventually revealed an element so rare and lethal that its presence stunned even the most experienced forensic experts: polonium-210. This radioactive isotope, seldom encountered outside highly controlled environments, had been deliberately introduced into his body. The sophistication required to handle, transport, and administer it without immediate detection suggested the involvement of operatives with state-level resources. The discovery transformed the case from a medical anomaly into a geopolitical flashpoint, with implications extending far beyond his own fate. The revelation ignited an international storm, challenging diplomats and governments to confront a danger few could fully comprehend. Tensions between the United Kingdom and Russia escalated as officials demanded explanations, accountability, and swift responses. Intelligence agencies faced intense scrutiny, and questions arose about the reach of clandestine operations across borders. Each statement, each denial, and each subtle diplomatic move became strategically significant, while the public struggled to understand a threat that was both invisible and extraordinarily lethal. Media coverage amplified the stakes, presenting a story that intertwined heroism, tragedy, and the shadowy reach of intelligence networks. Newspapers documented the progression of his poisoning and detailed the meticulous investigation that followed. Analysts and commentators speculated about perpetrators, motivations, and the hidden mechanisms behind the attack. The narrative became a cautionary tale, a warning of the consequences of exposing classified operations and challenging powerful actors. In the public eye, the story transformed into a symbol of courage, vulnerability, and the hidden dangers of truth. Questions lingered about the orchestrators, motives, and timing, leaving a web of uncertainty that stretched across borders and agencies. Who had ordered the attack, and why him at that precise moment? Analysts debated the possible chain of command, while whistleblowers and defectors worldwide watched cautiously, fully aware that defiance carried consequences. The case remained a stark reminder of the peril inherent in uncovering secrets few were meant to see. Even in quiet corners of London, the echoes of those final days suggested that some dangers leave traces that cannot be erased. Laboratories traced radioactive contamination to locations he had visited, confirming both the rarity and intentionality of the attack. Every document, every meeting, and every movement became part of a larger story that could not be fully resolved. His death extended beyond one man, illustrating the silent but pervasive reach of covert power and the chilling consequences of exposing it. Even in death, Litvinenko left behind a trace of mystery that glowed far brighter than any truth he had dared to reveal. The unanswered questions around Philip Marshall. The discovery of Philip Marshall and his 2 children dead in their California home sent shockwaves through the investigative communities that had followed his work, immediately raising questions that would remain unresolved. Authorities described the scene with official restraint, labelling it a murder-suicide, but the circumstances appeared unusually complex to those who knew his meticulous nature. Friends, colleagues, and fellow researchers struggled to reconcile the violent outcome with the disciplined and thoughtful man they knew. Each detail, from the positioning of the bodies to the timing of events, suggested that the narrative was more complicated than the official explanation allowed. The ordinary calm of suburban life seemed shattered by a sequence of events that resisted easy interpretation. Some neighbours noted the absence of typical morning activity, while others recalled that Marshall had been increasingly absorbed in his research in the weeks prior, hinting at a growing tension beneath the surface. Philip Marshall had spent decades as a commercial airline pilot, a career defined by precision, calculation, and attention to minute detail. He flew for multiple carriers over the course of his career, gaining experience on both domestic and international flights, and held positions that required careful monitoring of flight safety and regulatory compliance. Beyond navigating aircraft safely, he had turned his focus to investigating anomalies in aviation security, government oversight, and potential covert operations connected to high-profile airline incidents. His professional background gave him unique access to flight records, aviation databases, and contacts that most independent researchers could not reach, allowing him to trace patterns that others might miss. Over time, his work had moved into sensitive territory, where uncovering information could carry unforeseen risks. Every discovery he documented heightened the stakes of inquiry, revealing the intersection of expertise, curiosity, and danger, and emphasizing why his findings were both compelling and potentially threatening. His research explored incidents that official reports often dismissed or left unexplained, including crashes, near misses, and patterns that suggested deliberate manipulation or cover-ups. Marshall scrutinized publicly available data alongside anecdotal accounts from pilots and industry insiders, searching for connections between aviation safety, intelligence agencies, and potentially covert operations. He analysed anomalies in maintenance records, air traffic communication irregularities, and unexplained deviations from standard flight procedures, noting coincidences that hinted at a broader pattern. His findings were meticulous, cross-referenced, and presented with caution, yet they often contradicted the narratives provided by authorities or were ignored in mainstream reporting. In compiling this evidence, he positioned himself at the delicate intersection of public accountability and classified secrecy. Each revelation, carefully documented, carried the unspoken risk that someone might act to silence the inquiry. Through blog posts, interviews, and private notes, Marshall communicated his concerns without directly threatening anyone, yet a sense of danger permeated his writing. He cautioned that the information he uncovered could provoke severe responses if exposed to the wrong parties. While these warnings were subtle, they reflected an acute awareness of the precarious balance between truth and personal safety. Some posts detailed aviation incidents with unexplained causes and questioned whether covert operations had influenced public reports, while others delved into systemic failures within regulatory agencies. The tone of his work implied that the pursuit of hidden knowledge, even when pursued responsibly, could place him in a perilous position. His dedication to exposing anomalies in aviation security and government oversight made him a figure of interest to both supporters and skeptics. On the morning of December 2, 2013, law enforcement entered Marshall's home to find a scene officially ruled a murder-suicide. Philip Marshall and his 2 children were dead. The initial report described a domestic tragedy, but friends and associates quickly noted inconsistencies with his character and habits. Marshall had been meticulous in planning and routine. Sudden, violent action seemed incongruous with the man they knew. Every facet of the discovery, from the layout of the scene to the timing, contributed to a sense of unresolved mystery that drew attention beyond the immediate community. Investigators noted that items in the home were arranged unusually, and some documents related to his research appeared displaced, raising questions about whether the scene was fully representative of what had transpired. The official narrative raised as many questions as it sought to answer. Forensic examination revealed elements that seemed unusual for a straightforward murder-suicide. Certain injuries, the positioning of objects, and the sequencing of events did not align perfectly with the official explanation. Experts familiar with crime scene analysis debated whether these anomalies might indicate alternative possibilities or simply gaps in reporting. Some noted that the absence of certain expected evidence, such as signs of struggle or defensive wounds, contradicted the simplicity of the ruling. Each inconsistency became a thread in a broader tapestry of uncertainty, reinforcing the notion that the official story might not fully reflect the truth. Investigators faced the challenge of interpreting evidence that was both detailed and incomplete, leaving the public to confront the tension between known facts and lingering unknowns. Marshall's previous research into intelligence-linked aviation incidents added a chilling dimension to the case. He had examined unexplained crashes, potential false flag operations, and possible connections between government agencies and commercial aviation companies. While none of his findings were universally verified, the specificity and consistency of his analysis made them compelling to a community of researchers dedicated to understanding hidden risks in aviation and intelligence operations. Some researchers noted that his conclusions, if accurate, could implicate actors with extraordinary access and resources, adding to the potential stakes surrounding his death. The juxtaposition of his professional expertise and investigative work deepened the sense that his death might intersect with the very dangers he sought to expose. Media coverage of the deaths remained largely conservative, focusing on the official ruling, yet online communities quickly dissected every available detail. Forums and research blogs mapped timelines, compiled documents, and debated potential motives, linking Marshall's investigative work to the circumstances of his death. Analysts speculated on whether the murder-suicide ruling accounted for all evidence, with some suggesting external interference could not be dismissed entirely. Observers noted that his prior communications and research had attracted attention in small circles of intelligence and aviation researchers, adding layers of complexity to the case. The story became both a news item and a subject of ongoing scrutiny, illustrating the tension between public narrative and private knowledge. Debates about motive and opportunity dominated discussions following the deaths. How could a disciplined and thoughtful individual carry out such an act against his family, or had an external force orchestrated events to appear as a domestic tragedy? Analysts and researchers proposed scenarios involving pressures from those potentially implicated in his work, emphasizing the intersection of risk, exposure, and consequence. Some independent investigators pointed to the timing of his final publications as suggestive of a motive, while others highlighted procedural gaps in the official investigation. Each interpretation reinforced the sense of unresolved tension surrounding the case, highlighting the persistent uncertainty that enveloped his death. Regardless of the circumstances, Marshall's investigations left behind extensive documentation, interviews, and research notes that continue to circulate among aviation and intelligence analysts. His work sparked ongoing discussion about aviation safety, government oversight, and the potential consequences for individuals probing sensitive topics. The records illustrate both the value and the danger of pursuing truths that intersect with classified or politically sensitive operations. Colleagues who had communicated with him in the weeks before his death noted his careful documentation and deliberate methodology, underscoring how unusual the outcome appeared. Even after his death, Marshall's work remained a focal point for questions about accountability, secrecy, and the potential costs of inquiry. Key questions continue to linger. Who, if anyone, stood to benefit from his death, and what threats might have preceded it? Was there evidence overlooked or suppressed? And what do the surviving records truly reveal about the risks he faced? The questions surrounding timing, motives, and possible external involvement contribute to the tension and sense of danger in his story. Each unanswered question contributes to the suspense surrounding the case, creating a story in which certainty remains elusive. The absence of definitive answers sustains the sense of mystery, leaving both experts and observers wary of claiming conclusions. Even as researchers, journalists, and investigators continue to probe the circumstances of his death, the story remains suspended between revelation and ambiguity. Every detail, from his meticulously documented research to the peculiarities of the crime scene, suggests that some secrets, once pursued, carry consequences beyond comprehension. The juxtaposition of ordinary life with extraordinary and unexplained events underscores the chilling possibility that uncovering sensitive truths can provoke outcomes both tragic and enigmatic. In the silence left behind, Philip Marshall's work whispers warnings that remain as unresolved and dangerous as the secrets he sought to expose. The mysterious fate of Sergei Magnitsky. A single discrepancy in a financial ledger became the thread that would unravel a web of corruption no one dared to expose. Sergei Magnitsky, a seasoned tax lawyer, had begun examining transactions linked to government contractors and law enforcement agencies when subtle irregularities caught his attention. What initially seemed like accounting errors soon revealed patterns pointing to systematic embezzlement of taxpayer funds. Each figure he scrutinized, every invoice traced, drew him deeper into a labyrinth of hidden alliances and illicit enrichment, where conventional oversight appeared deliberately absent. The implications of his findings suggested a network capable of operating with impunity, invisible to most and untouchable to ordinary investigators. Some of the shell companies he uncovered had names that seemed innocuous, yet they concealed layers of ownership, offshore accounts, and intermediaries designed to confuse auditors and deter scrutiny, underscoring the sophistication of the corruption he faced. Magnitsky's expertise in auditing and tax law allowed him to follow money where it was meant to remain hidden, tracing transactions others overlooked. He had worked with top accounting firms and collaborated with government auditors, giving him access to records few outside these circles could examine. His methodical approach combined legal precision with forensic rigor, allowing him to link shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex financial instruments to officials and intermediaries engaged in widespread fraud. Each discovery amplified both the significance of his work and the personal risk he faced. Magnitsky operated in a space where knowledge itself could be dangerous, and the more he uncovered, the more isolated his position became. Colleagues recall that he often warned them not to discuss sensitive findings casually, aware that whispers alone could reach unintended ears. Patterns of embezzlement emerged from the routine filings he examined, implicating officials at the highest levels of government and law enforcement. Funds meant for public projects were siphoned through a series of companies controlled by insiders, then laundered to obscure destinations. Magnitsky meticulously documented each transaction, compiling evidence that left little room for ambiguity, yet carried enormous political sensitivity. The scale of the fraud was staggering, involving hundreds of millions of dollars and a breadth of participants who wielded influence across multiple agencies. In tracing the money, he found that those entrusted with oversight had either turned a blind eye or actively facilitated the diversion of resources. Some of his findings suggested intentional obfuscation of financial records, hinting at a deliberate effort to make detection exceedingly difficult even for experts. He understood that each document he highlighted, each report he submitted, could provoke powerful adversaries who operated without accountability or oversight. Colleagues noted that he worked late into the night, often revisiting records to verify calculations or cross-reference accounts, aware that any mistake could weaken the credibility of his findings. Warnings were subtle but present. Some auditors suggested caution, and internal communications hinted at unease over potential exposure. Magnitsky navigated these pressures with a careful balance of transparency and discretion, determined to expose wrongdoing without unnecessarily provoking retaliation. Yet even his prudence could not eliminate the danger inherent in exposing high-level corruption. In private discussions, he sometimes remarked on the invisible network of enforcers who could act to silence those who dug too deep, emphasizing that the stakes extended beyond paperwork into personal risk. In 2008, the instruments of the very system he'd scrutinized were turned against him, as charges were leveled that seemed to contradict the facts he had uncovered. Authorities accused him of complicity in the very fraud he had reported, framing the narrative in a way that deflected scrutiny from powerful actors. Magnitsky's arrest was sudden and meticulously executed, and the pre-trial detention that followed placed him in the harsh environment of Butyrka prison. What had been an office of discovery became a place of confinement, where every procedural detail and bureaucratic maneuver reinforced the power imbalance he had confronted from afar. Documents were reportedly delayed or misplaced, limiting his ability to mount a full defense, and legal observers noted irregularities in how evidence was presented. Within the walls of pre-trial detention, neglect and intimidation became part of the daily routine, systematically eroding his health and resolve. Cells were overcrowded, access to basic medical care was restricted, and reports suggest that requests for assistance were delayed or ignored. Fellow detainees observed the strain imposed on his body and mind, noting how he remained alert to procedural irregularities, even under extreme conditions. Each day underscored the isolation inherent in challenging a system that could mobilize its authority to suppress inconvenient truths. Some reports suggested that even interactions with guards carried implicit warnings, creating an environment where the pressure to remain silent was constant. Weeks of inadequate care left him weakened, a stark contrast to the vigor with which he had pursued each lead and documented each anomaly. Magnitsky's health deteriorated progressively, with conditions that could have been treated, ignored, or exacerbated by delay. Visitors and lawyers reported that he appeared emaciated and fatigued, yet mentally engaged, continuing to discuss inconsistencies in his case and the evidence he had gathered. The mismatch between his professional acumen and the vulnerability imposed by detention highlighted the extraordinary risk borne by those who confront entrenched corruption. Friends noted that he maintained a meticulous record of interactions with officials, anticipating that such documentation could serve as evidence should his safety be compromised. As news of his plight spread, human rights organizations and journalists began to track the case, drawing attention to inconsistencies in both procedure and motive. International attention placed pressure on the authorities, but official responses remained measured, offering assurances without substantive change. Reports emphasized procedural compliance while neglecting the broader context of systemic corruption that Magnitsky had uncovered. Analysts and advocates used his findings to illustrate how ordinary oversight mechanisms could be circumvented when power and influence were concentrated among a select few. Some diplomats privately expressed alarm over the precision with which the embezzlement scheme was structured, recognizing the potential international ramifications. In his final weeks, Magnitsky's efforts to protest the charges and highlight the fraud continued, even as his body and strength failed him. Letters were written, appeals submitted, and international observers informed, all while he remained confined under conditions that made recovery impossible. Each petition served as both a record and a warning, testifying to the dangers faced by those who challenge financial malfeasance linked to state authority. His persistence emphasized that knowledge itself had consequences and that exposing wrongdoing could provoke retribution from those who operated in secrecy. Colleagues who attempted to amplify his findings faced their own subtle pressures, illustrating that the reach of the network extended beyond the prison walls. The revelations he left behind forced officials to confront uncomfortable truths, revealing how systemic corruption could thrive under the veneer of legality. Documents, audit trails, and corroborating reports traced the flow of embezzled funds, leaving a trail that could not be fully erased. Authorities faced international scrutiny, while domestic institutions struggled to balance public perception with the realities of politically sensitive exposure. The contrast between Magnitsky's meticulous documentation and the opacity of governmental response heightened the sense of intrigue surrounding both the fraud and the personal risks he had encountered. Some investigators noted that the trail of funds he documented connected to previously unexplored jurisdictions, suggesting that exposure could have ripple effects far beyond Russia itself. Though he would not live to see justice served, the meticulous documentation of his findings became a blueprint for ongoing investigations and international sanctions. His work inspired legislation in other countries aimed at holding officials accountable for human rights violations and financial crimes, including the United States Magnitsky Act. researchers and advocacy groups continue to reference his records, using them to map networks of corruption and to advocate for transparency and accountability. Magnitsky's legacy demonstrates how one individual's pursuit of truth can resonate far beyond their own lifetime, influencing policy and investigations across borders. Unanswered questions persist about who orchestrated the suppression of his work and how many of the hidden networks he uncovered remain operational. While some actors were prosecuted and funds recovered, the full scope of complicity remains uncertain. Analysts continue to debate whether his detention and treatment were solely punitive or part of a broader effort to protect entrenched interests from exposure. Each lingering question reinforces the sense that uncovering financial and political truths carries profound risk, and that some threads of the story remain deliberately obscured. The shadow of Sergei Magnitsky's revelations lingers, a silent warning that truths too dangerous to confront can echo far beyond those who first discover them. The death of journalist Gary Webb. The newsroom was abuzz with the promise of a story few dared to touch, as Gary Webb prepared to publish a series that would challenge conventional narratives about the intersection of intelligence operations and the crack cocaine epidemic in the United States. Known for his meticulous reporting at the San Jose Mercury News, Webb had cultivated sources who provided insight into channels of drug distribution and the allegations of indirect involvement by government agencies. Each interview, document, and cross-referenced lead carried the weight of potential controversy, hinting at consequences that extended well beyond ordinary journalistic risk. The atmosphere was tense, the newsroom alive with anticipation and a subtle sense of unease, as the implications of the upcoming series became increasingly clear. Webb understood that his work could place him under scrutiny from both media peers and entities far removed from public view, whose interests might be threatened by exposure. Webb had spent years cultivating sources and piecing together a narrative that suggested unsettling connections between intelligence operations and the drug trade, including allegations that funds from drug sales had been funneled to support foreign policy objectives in Central America. His reporting focused on the origins of crack cocaine in Los Angeles during the 1980s, and the role that certain Nicaraguan Contra networks had allegedly played in its distribution, a story corroborated in part by congressional reports and declassified CIA documents. Webb cross-checked government records, court filings, and interviews with former law enforcement and intelligence officials, painstakingly reconstructing a network that suggested both negligence and complicity within agencies tasked with oversight. Each piece of evidence he verified strengthened the story, while simultaneously placing him in the crosshairs of powerful interests wary of exposure. Public reaction to the Dark Alliance series was immediate and polarizing, with readers, critics, and colleagues divided between shock, disbelief, and cautious validation. The revelations struck a nerve, touching on systemic issues that intersected with civil rights, urban policy, and intelligence oversight, while raising broader questions about government accountability. Community forums erupted with debate, academic commentators questioned the implications, and the general public grappled with the possibility that state-sanctioned oversight might have been entangled with illicit networks. The story quickly transcended local coverage, drawing national attention and prompting congressional staffers, advocacy groups, and investigative journalists to re-examine the historical record and the previously unchallenged narratives of the 1980s. Mainstream media scrutiny intensified as rival outlets examined Webb's work, questioning sourcing and methodology while cautiously corroborating certain claims. Major newspapers published editorials that both criticized and defended his findings, creating a polarized narrative that often overshadowed the details he had painstakingly documented. Intelligence spokespeople and government officials issued statements denying any wrongdoing, emphasizing procedural compliance while avoiding direct engagement with the specific allegations Webb had outlined. The tension between the official narrative and Webb's reporting created a persistent undercurrent of suspicion, leaving readers uncertain where truth ended and institutional defense began. Some media analysts later acknowledged that the story's complexity was difficult to fully grasp, without extensive knowledge of covert operations and historical context, reinforcing the sense that the narrative contained layers few could safely examine. As criticism mounted, Webb faced professional isolation and personal attacks, with his credibility questioned by colleagues who had once praised his investigative rigor. the intense scrutiny extended to his social and professional life, making routine interactions feel fraught with danger. Interviews became exercises in caution, with each statement carefully considered against the potential for misrepresentation or selective reporting. Legal threats and public rebukes compounded the pressure, forcing Webb to weigh every disclosure against potential consequences. The cumulative weight of skepticism, coupled with subtle intimidation, underscored the stakes of investigating matters that intersected with intelligence and covert operations, where exposure could be as hazardous as it was necessary. The pressure of the controversy followed him across city streets and into private moments, reminding him that powerful actors could exert influence far beyond public view. Webb reported receiving anonymous calls, veiled threats, and subtle warnings from individuals whose allegiances were difficult to discern. Even within the journalistic community, colleagues debated whether to publicly support his findings, aware that association could invite scrutiny or professional repercussions. Some sources recounted being contacted by unknown parties after interviews, creating a climate of pervasive unease. The environment cultivated an almost constant vigilance, blending anxiety with the drive to maintain integrity in reporting, while reinforcing that uncovering sensitive truths carried consequences that extended into both professional and personal spheres. He continued to investigate quietly, compiling additional evidence and protecting confidential sources while maintaining the rigorous standards that had defined his career. Webb cross-referenced court documents with intelligence reports and first-hand accounts, aiming to ensure that each claim was verifiable and defensible. His diligence reflected both a commitment to truth and an understanding of the peril inherent in challenging entrenched power structures. Every new lead reinforced the importance of discretion, as even minor errors or premature disclosures could compromise sources or invite retaliation. He also reached out to historians and investigative peers to verify aspects of his reporting, further embedding his work in a network of checks designed to withstand scrutiny and challenge denials. The cumulative stress and public vilification weighed heavily on him, affecting his health, work, and personal relationships. Webb's writing became increasingly insular, with long nights spent revisiting documents, rechecking sources, and analysing patterns overlooked by mainstream investigators. Friends and colleagues noted a visible tension, a combination of exhaustion and unwavering focus, as he sought to navigate the fine line between exposure and safety. The intensity of the scrutiny left little room for rest or reassurance, creating an environment in which every interaction carried both opportunity and risk. His meticulous work ethic masked the toll the controversy took on his mental and physical well-being, a silent testament to the cost of pursuing truths others feared to confront. Webb's reporting remained meticulous, a testament to the standards he had set before facing relentless scrutiny. Even under pressure, he maintained detailed notes, verified every claim, and adhered to journalistic ethics that demanded corroboration and accuracy. His persistence ensured that, despite the controversy and personal cost, the information he uncovered retained credibility and continued to challenge official accounts. The rigor of his work became a counterpoint to the storm of criticism, highlighting the tension between truth-seeking and institutional resistance. Colleagues later observed that few reporters could match the thoroughness with which Webb had assembled his evidence, a fact that contributed both to the story's impact and to the ire it provoked. Support from some investigative journalists persisted, yet the intensity of the controversy left Webb professionally marginalised and personally vulnerable. Opportunities for advancement diminished, and invitations to speak or publish were tempered by caution. The social and professional networks that had once supported him became hesitant, their silence amplifying the sense of isolation. Even minor professional missteps were magnified in the public discourse, creating an environment in which Webb's every action was scrutinised and interpreted through the lens of the controversy surrounding his reporting. Meanwhile, younger journalists continued to cite his work as foundational, illustrating how influence and danger can coexist in the realm of investigative reporting. The circumstances surrounding his death in 2004 raised questions, with official reports describing suicide but friends and colleagues noting contradictions and unusual details. Webb was found with gunshot wounds to the head and chest, a combination that forensic experts said was atypical for conventional suicide cases. Investigators concluded that the deaths were self-inflicted, but discrepancies in scene documentation ballistic analysis and timing left lingering uncertainties. Family members, friends, and fellow journalists continued to question the narrative, pointing to the extraordinary pressures and threats he had faced as context for his demise. Over the years, the case has remained a subject of study for investigative reporters and criminal analysts, seeking to understand the intersection of personal vulnerability and professional risk in high-stakes reporting. His reporting continues to influence discussion on intelligence, the drug trade, and the limits of journalistic freedom. Academics, policy analysts, and investigative journalists reference the Dark Alliance series as a case study in both the potential and peril of uncovering uncomfortable truths. The story has been revisited in documentaries, books, and panels, highlighting how his meticulous documentation and ethical rigor created a lasting impact despite attempts to undermine him. Webb's legacy serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of power, secrecy, and the dangers inherent in exposing networks that operate beyond conventional oversight. Analysts often return to his work to explore how disinformation campaigns, selective criticism, and institutional pushback can shape public perception of the investigative reporting. The truth Webb chased left shadows that lingered long after his death, suggesting that some stories carry dangers far beyond the reporter who dares to tell them. The killing of Daphne Caruana Galizia. The threats had been mounting for months, each one a silent reminder that uncovering financial secrets tied to politicians and offshore networks could carry deadly consequences. Daphne Caruana Galizia had long documented the flows of hidden money, tracing connections that powerful figures hoped would remain invisible. Her meticulous approach combined investigative intuition with rigorous examination of public records, leaked documents, and European Union filings, revealing a network of transactions that ordinary oversight could not penetrate. Each revelation brought admiration from the public and unease from those who feared exposure, creating a tension that pervaded her daily life. The stakes of her work were high, and she knew that curiosity in this arena could be perilous. Her research revealed intricate webs linking Maltese politicians to offshore companies, shell corporations, and financial channels designed to obscure both ownership and intent. Each lead she followed highlighted subtle mechanisms of influence, tracing payments and transfers that suggested both personal enrichment and broader schemes of corruption. By connecting these dots, Caruana Galizia exposed how power could operate through opaque networks, leaving ordinary citizens unaware of the forces shaping government decisions. Her reporting illuminated the hidden intersection of money, politics, and secrecy, making the invisible visible in a way few dared to attempt. Among the documents she uncovered were EU subsidy records, cross-border transactions, and corporate filings that implicated intermediaries in multiple jurisdictions, underscoring the transnational sophistication of the schemes. Known for her uncompromising integrity and fearless reporting, she had built a career on challenging authority and holding the powerful accountable. Her columns and blog posts reflected an unwavering commitment to transparency, often presenting complex financial information in a way accessible to the public. Colleagues recognized her meticulous methodology, combining document analysis, source verification, and persistence in the face of intimidation. Each investigation required balancing the pursuit of truth with personal safety, yet she refused to let threats dictate her work. Her professional vigilance extended to routinely monitoring suspicious activity around her home and vehicle, aware that the stakes of exposure could extend far beyond reputation. In the months leading up to her death, Caruana Galizia published exposes connecting local political figures to money laundering and bribe schemes that extended across national borders. She meticulously cited public filings, corporate registries, and EU investigative reports, leaving a trail of evidence that challenged the complacency of officials and regulators alike. Her revelations demonstrated how seemingly legitimate business operations could mask illicit transfers, highlighting the vulnerabilities in both national and European oversight mechanisms. Each report deepened her impact and amplified the potential consequences of her findings, prompting discussions in Brussels and beyond about the integrity of EU-funded programs in Malta. Threats had become an unavoidable part of her life, ranging from anonymous messages and online harassment to lawsuits aimed at silencing her investigations. Surveillance and intimidation were subtle yet persistent, a constant reminder that those exposed by her reporting could strike back. Threats escalated in frequency after her work revealed connections, between influential figures and offshore holdings linked to the Panama Papers. She navigated these dangers with caution but remained unflinching in her commitment to uncover the truth. Friends and colleagues noted that the persistent hostility underscored the risks she accepted in the pursuit of accountability, as even routine inquiries could provoke retaliatory action. Her work sparked public protests, EU inquiries, and intense media attention, amplifying both her influence and the potential threat to those implicated. Citizens and journalists rallied around her findings, demanding transparency and reforms, while political insiders sought ways to mitigate the fallout. International NGOs and press freedom organizations began documenting harassment campaigns against her, including smear attempts and coordinated online attacks. The combination of grassroots mobilization and international scrutiny highlighted the reach of her reporting and the tension it generated within Malta's political landscape. The car bomb that claimed her life was executed with precision, detonated beneath her vehicle as she drove near her home. The attack left her car obliterated, a violent interruption of her daily routine that underscored the lethal risks of exposing entrenched corruption. Investigators later noted the sophistication of the device, suggesting the involvement of professional operatives who had planned the assassination with careful attention to timing, concealment, and forensic avoidance. Ballistics analysis and explosive residue studies indicated expertise beyond local criminal activity, hinting at broader coordination and preparation. The act sent shockwaves across Malta, transforming her death into a symbol of the dangers faced by investigative journalists worldwide. Investigators eventually traced connections between the suspects and organised crime networks, while evidence suggested links to political figures, yet the individuals who masterminded the attack remained elusive. Arrests were made, but many questions persisted about the chain of command and the extent to which influential figures had orchestrated or facilitated the assassination. Forensic and financial evidence revealed transactions that may have funded the operation, yet tracing ultimate responsibility remained fraught with obstacles. Each development illuminated parts of the complex web she had exposed, yet the full truth remained obscured, heightening the sense of unresolved danger surrounding her work. Her death reverberated internationally, drawing attention from European governments, press freedom organisations, and anti-corruption advocates. The assassination prompted debates about journalist safety, systemic corruption, and the responsibilities of states to protect those exposing wrongdoing. Investigative reporters and anti-corruption agencies used her findings to guide ongoing inquiries into European financial misconduct, ensuring that her work continued to have a tangible impact despite her absence. Caruana Galicia's reporting became a catalyst for broader conversations about the intersection of governance, secrecy, and accountability, underscoring how her revelations had global significance. Despite the violence that ended her life, her investigations continue to inform ongoing scrutiny of political and financial wrongdoing. Archived blog posts, published reports, and documents she had meticulously collected remain valuable references for journalists, researchers, and investigators seeking to understand the networks she had exposed. Her methodology, evidence, and unwavering commitment serve as both a guide and a warning for those who dare to follow in her footsteps. International collaborative investigations have cited her work when tracing shell companies and financial conduits tied to corruption, showing that her reporting had lasting practical effects. Unresolved questions linger about who ultimately ordered the attack, how far the network she exposed extended, and whether all responsible parties were identified or prosecuted. Parliamentary inquiries, EU investigations, and independent audits have shed light on some aspects, yet the identities of all orchestrators remain uncertain. The precise motives behind her assassination and the full scope of collusion remain subjects of speculation and ongoing inquiry. These uncertainties sustain a persistent sense of tension, illustrating the dangers inherent in uncovering entrenched systems of power and the limits of accountability when confronted with covert influence. Caruana Galicia's story remains a stark reminder of the costs of exposing hidden truths, where courage and professional rigour intersect with lethal consequences. Her life and work illustrate how the pursuit of transparency can provoke retaliatory action from those determined to remain in the shadows. The legacy she left continues to challenge governments, journalists, and the public to confront corruption, even when doing so carries extraordinary risk. Daphne Caruana Galicia's revelations continue to echo, a stark warning that exposing entrenched power can provoke consequences with lethal precision.